All right, so we're doing our year-end review roundups, and one of your two main beats has been the UAW. It's been quite a year of UAW coverage. Let's go back to the beginning. At the start of the year, was Ray Curry the president at the start of the year, or did he come in actually during 23?
Yeah, no, he was still the president. There was a lot left to figure out. The elections had happened the previous November, and nothing had been settled yet, and the run for president went to a runoff.
Even then was extremely close. It looked like it was going to be contested up to and into the Constitutional Convention. But Ray Curry stood down, let Shawn Fain, the reformer, have his shot.
Literally 24 hours before their convention to prepare for maybe some of the most consequential contract bargaining that they were going to have in quite some time. New president takes over, first ever direct election, really historic. A lot of change happening at once, and that really carried on through the rest of the year.
And of course, I'm sure our audience knows, but just to remember for historical context, right? This is in the wake of a massive scandal, sent two former UAW presidents to prison, at least briefly, several other officials from the union, from Stellantis, just a federal monitor still in-house, keeping an eye on things to make sure that they're following all the rules.
Exactly. And this was really the sign that the membership wanted change. Now, to be fair, not a lot of the membership voted, but those who did really showed an appetite for something different. Even though Ray Curry was never implicated in the corruption scandal, him and Rory Gamble, his predecessor, were both pretty clean, straight, got the house in order kind of guys. But the membership wanted to move beyond that sort of system that had the leaders hand select their successors, and now they have the power, and they elected someone who ultimately delivered for them.
Well, as you noted, it was such a low turnout, and close election. My takeaway all through this process has been that Shawn Fain was elected with no mandate, no base, and no machine that his predecessors all had. It was really a challenge for him to take control and take the lead of the union. But boy, did he do that in a big way.
Exactly. And to your point, he really had to do this on the fly. There were some transition memos that leaked that sort of laid out what they wanted to do. And they called it a contract campaign, really getting the membership unified and ready to go up against the Detroit Three. Typically, you'd take a whole year to establish that contract campaign. They had a couple months, and they were still able to be effective and get the rank and file really on the same page and prepared to strike and prepared to hold out until they got a lot of what they wanted.
This all happens, this chaos within the UAW all happens against a backdrop of a really surging labor movement in America. Labor is as popular now as it's been in 60 years. And there were some other strikes, UAW and non-UAW organizing and strikes around the country. We saw battery manufacturer Clarios, the aluminum company Constellium, but maybe on a bigger stage, Mack Truck, UPS had really tense negotiations that narrowly avoided a strike. How did all that play into what we ended up seeing with the UAW?
Well, I think you can even go a year or two back and talk about companies like John Deere or Case New Holland and some of the labor strife we've seen there. Again, you mentioned maybe other industries as well, whether it's the Hollywood writers' strike or things of that nature.
Amazon, Starbucks, yeah.
And really, the UAW was able to ride this wave of momentum and really channel a lot of frustration that I think the working class at large has felt, whether it's been the pandemic or effects like inflation. I feel like they are not getting their slice of the pie, and the UAW was able to use that to hammer the companies and say, we need everything we lost back in the recession. We need everything we've lost, even in the good years when inflation has sort of drug down our wages. We need that all back now.
And so before we get to how much of that they got, there was some bruised feelings along the way. He really focused. He came out right out of the gate with, the automaker is our enemy. They are the one true enemy. And for some company, I think for most of the companies, but especially, for Ford, where, Bill Ford has been deeply involved in UAW talks, labor relations, since he started at the company, it really kind of stung.
I think so. No, let's be honest here. The union got some pretty great results, but how they got there, a little questionable at times. You saw some really nasty rhetoric, honestly, on both sides. As you mentioned, Sean Fain came in on that convention, his first day in office, calling the automakers the enemy, saying they needed to prepare for war. The automakers came out swinging. You saw Mary Barra, Jim Farley say things that they typically never say. They're very sort of calm, cool, and collected, accusing the union, accusing Sean Fain of hijacking the agenda for his own purposes. Ultimately, though, I think this was a set of negotiations where no matter who was president, no matter who was in charge, the union was going to win a lot back. Mm-hmm. Just all the conditions were there and right for the taking. But because of the aggressiveness that the union showed and the different tactics they had in terms of their strike and their messaging, I think they won a lot more than they otherwise would have.
It was interesting. There was all this hostile rhetoric and hurt feelings on both sides, but the way they did this strike, labeled as a stand-up strike to echo the sit-down strikes from the 30s, but they really were less damaging economically than even the strike against GM 4 years earlier.
For sure. I think each of the automakers has said the strike cost them around $1 billion, give or take a couple $100 million. In 2019, it cost GM $3 billion, right? And these strikes lasted longer than the strike against GM. So at the end of the day, if you're the companies, this was not as bad as it could have been. Yeah, you gave up a lot more, but if you would have continued to hold out, the union wasn't going to crack anytime soon, and that strike would have added up. So at the end of the day, it was a cost-benefit analysis. Hey, we give them the raises they want. We throw in a couple more percentages here and there. Then finally we can end this and move forward.
I mean, there were some pretty extreme asks up front, like a 4-day work week and 42% raises, but they still got 25% in, like nominal raises, which are going to compound. And then there's the cost of living adjustments, the very rich contracts.
Really life-changing contracts. I don't think that's hyperbole to say, especially for a lot of the younger, newer workers who were making really as low as $16 an hour. And now, at the end of this deal in 2028, those same workers could be up into the 40s in the hourly rate. So a lot of what they got, I think, can be credited to the union's aggressiveness. I don't think there is anything on the table that they possibly could have gotten that they backed off of. Some of the things you mentioned that they didn't get were just so pie in the sky. I don't think
defined benefit pensions was the other big one.
It was never going to happen under any circumstance. And maybe they could have used that as leverage and say, okay, well, all right, we'll drop that, but give us a couple more in the percentage raise.
So we come to the end, and then there's peace, there's détente at least, but not really a kumbaya moment between the union and the automakers. They're still calling each other enemies.
Well, I think in 2024 here and moving forward, it's going to be really interesting to see how this relationship evolves, because the union's already moving on to its next phase, which it wants to parlay these contract wins into organizational wins and bring in a lot of the non-union companies to grow its base. And it's saying Ford, GM, and Stellantis have always opposed that. They want it to be the union workforce against the non-union companies. And now Sean Fain's saying, hey, wait, these are going to be our future members. We're not going to go with you to be against them. We're going to try to bring them in the fold too.
Is that right? Has the D3 been opposed to organize? I mean, that was Lee Iacocca's argument back in the 80s, 70s and 80s was, hey, make these companies come to America and deal with American workers and presumably the American union and see how they do then, smart guys.
Well, this was, again, a sign of that animosity during the talks, because Bill Ford came out there and in one of his speeches, he said, listen, this should be not Ford versus the UAW. This should be Ford and the UAW versus everybody else who's trying to steal our market share. And Sean Fain shot back, not anymore.
Right. So what do we think? What's the outlook for the UAW to organize Tesla or Toyota or Honda?
It's going to be a really steep hill to climb. The union has tried for decades to organize the American South and tried to organize Tesla in California. And aside from some victories, Freightliner, Daimler trucks here and there, it's almost exclusively failed when you think about multiple attempts at Volkswagen, multiple attempts at Nissan. It just hasn't happened for a variety of factors. I don't know if they can overcome everything that's doomed them in the past, but arguably they have maybe their best shot than they've had in quite some time, given the overall sentiment for unions, given the friend they have in the White House. This could be the right time to strike.
Of course, we've seen a lot of those automakers offer or just grant their employees pretty significant wage increases comparable to the 10, 11, 12% that UAW and Unifor workers are getting this year. And I guess we'll see how closely they track in the future.
It's going to be fascinating to watch every single play-by-play of how this happens, because the automakers are doing this to stop unionization. Now Sean Fain's going to come out and he'll have his response, and we'll see that dance that they do.
One last thought on the UAW, the union, and it sort of gets into the politics, and you mentioned Joe Biden, right? It's like usually Democrats and unions are kind of on the same side, at least in terms of labor versus capital, labor versus management, but not always on the environment, because the union's financial health comes from selling big trucks and SUVs that make a lot of money, the same as the companies that employ them. And of course, we have an administration that's really trying to push EVs and fuel economy. How does that tension play out?
Well, it seems like they're trying to get on the same page. I think even Sean Fain's predecessors have said, yeah, we're a little concerned about the potential job losses from EVs, about the whole question of demand for that kind of product, but we're on board as long as we can make them good union-paying jobs. And Sean Fain's largely taken that same stance. He's rebranded it, as he's often done with a lot of things since he's been in office. He calls it a just transition. He wants the transition to this green economy to benefit the working class. And he's had discussions with President Biden and his administration to make sure that happens. Step one is starting to get that work under that master agreement at the same pay rates as some of these gasoline-powered assembly plants and powertrain plants. And we're starting to see that because of these contract deals.
So, I mean, we mentioned Joe Biden. One of the other things that was just so historic about this year and these talks was Joe Biden showing up at a picket line to speak to the UAW. I mean, it's pretty rare for presidents to get involved. Usually if they get involved at all in a labor dispute, it's just to encourage the leaders to come together and find a solution, not choosing sides and kind of rooting for labor against the companies.
Again, I think this was another instance where you have to credit Sean Fain and the union's aggressiveness, because he's withheld his endorsement of Joe Biden. And he said, listen, we need people that are going to stand up for us. And he almost bullied the president in a way into joining that picket line and to stating his support for the union's cause for those significant raises. And by the way, for organizing all the other non-union plants. I don't think you would have gotten that show of support if the union just would have gone the traditional route, sort of rubber stamp endorsement for the Democrat and move on.
Michael Martinez, staff reporter here at Automotive News, covers UAW, and I guess you'll keep covering them next year.
And the year after that. Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks, Mike.